Welcome to the Summercast, a podcast aimed at making fundamentalism great again by applying confessional Baptist doctrine to all of life.
Show me the money, right? That's what a lot of people are saying. Show me the money. If the Trump administration is going to send all Americans $1,000 or more in the form of a check or a direct deposit or something of the sort, we should be excited. That's going to add to our budget. That's going to add to the individual or the family economy. That is a great thing, right? Well, before we just per se accept everything that is being thrown at us during this volatile season, I think what we need to do is we need to ask questions. First of all, when it comes to the government distributing funds to anybody for any reason, really, the first question is obviously why. The second question usually becomes like, where does the money come from? And the third question is, are they going to want it back? But the thing we should be asking most fundamentally is, what is liberty? I think that's the most bedrock foundational question that we could ask in this situation that's not being asked enough. What is liberty? Well, perhaps one of the easiest ways to help somebody else understand what liberty is just to say what it's not. Liberty is not blank. What? What's the answer to that? Liberty is not what? And I would say, in the broadest possible terms, liberty is not dependence. Okay? Liberty is not dependence. If you are dependent on something to the extent that you are dependent upon that thing, you are not free. Okay? This goes back to our theology proper. I mean, if you look at a doctrine of God in any Orthodox Christian systematic theology, it usually talks about divine freedom or self existence, which usually entails the category of divine freedom. And the idea there is that God is not contingent upon that which is external to himself. In other words, the Creator is not contingent or dependent upon the creation. And because of that reality, because of that very fact, God is free. That's how God's freedom is really defined in our language about God. And so applying that in kind of an analogical way to humans, you can ask the question, what does it mean to be free? What does it mean to be at liberty, right? And the answer would be to be as independent as possible. Slaves are not free because they're not independent, right? Slaves are not free because they are dependent upon their slave masters. They're dependent upon their slave masters for things like food, for room and board, for work, even for labor. They're dependent. They're wholly dependent upon their masters, and that's what constitutes them as a slave, is their dependence level upon their masters. So if I depend on a government entity, let's kind of bring this a little bit closer to home. Let's say I depend on a government entity to tell me how to do my job, right? As a pastor, how to do my job as a pastor. Let's say I depend on the government to tell me what to preach, right? Well, I'm not free in that regard because I'm being determined by the government. The government is telling me what I can preach and what I can do, etc., etc., etc. Let's say I depend on the government as an individual, as the head of my household, on income, right? That means that I'm not free. Insofar as I depend on the government for my income, I am not free to go out and earn the income that I'm otherwise receiving from the government, right? And another thing is, if you view work from a biblical perspective, I'm not free to work in a biblical way because a worker is worth his wage. So I'm not even free to work for an income if I am receiving an income without work from the government. The welfare system is a perfect illustration of this today, right? People on welfare are in bondage or are dependent upon the government. And so when it comes to, I'm looking at the Washington Post article right here, Americans could get a check for $1,000 or more in the coming weeks. And I'm hearing now that it's most definitely probably going to be more. And this idea came from none other than Senator Mitt Romney, who's supposed to be a Republican. This is not a Republican policy. This is more like a Bernie Sanders policy right here. But alas, here we are. The government is going to start handing out $1,000, $2,000, maybe $4,500. Who knows how much money the government is planning, the federal Treasury is planning to disperse at this point. Now, we can't oversimplify this, right? We need to be asking the question, not only is it morally right to take the money? I think that's a valid question. I think that's a question we could ask. And that may be a question that's really dependent on situation, and so we'd get into some situational ethics at that juncture. But I think what's more important here is asking the question of whether or not the government should be doing this, right? Not necessarily whether or not the individual should be accepting what the government is getting ready to distribute. And the reason I say that is because there are many different situations in which an individual could, I believe, from a biblical standpoint, lawfully take the money that the government is handing out, essentially. And a situation in the extreme might include something like you're standing in a bread line for bread and some slop that's going to be rationed to you and your family, and you're barely going to be able to put food on the table for your children and for your wife, right? In that situation, I'd say, yeah, take the money, go to Walmart and buy some food and feed your kids, right? I mean, that's a no-brainer. I mean, there's no reason to get legalistic about this. But it is a good question to ask whether or not the government should be doing this, right? Because when the government does this, it's eliciting dependence. And when you elicit dependence, you are eliciting bondage. When you're eliciting bondage, you're eliciting slavery. Now, of course, we get into questions like, is slavery inherently wicked or evil? And that's a different discussion altogether. But in a free society, within the context of the United States, we don't have slaves, at least not legally, right? And so, or at least that's been the assumption. Maybe you can make a case that people who are in debt up to their eyeballs are in fact slaves. But the bottom line is that formally we have no slavery in this country. We are a country that has been predicated upon liberty, the right to liberty, the right to life, the right to the pursuit of happiness, and so on. And so in our American context, because of our founding documentation, like the Constitution, we want to stay away from dependence on the government. Now, if you are a Christian living in communist China or North Korea, and you're virtually forced to be cared for by the government, then that's the context in which you live. That's where you are. I mean, that's just what it is. But we are not that way in the United States, and so we need to be asking, how can we preserve our liberties as Americans, right? And it's not, I don't think it is wise to say that it is, without question, right for the government to be doing this. Now, some questions have been raised concerning the government's motives. Well, I mean, unless you assume that the government is Christian, the government's motives are always going to be tainted with, they're always going to be sinful. Genesis 6, Romans 3, 10, 11, 23, they're always going to be sinful. So we're not trying to discern motives here, though, so much as we are looking at the action itself. Like, should the American government be distributing $1,000 to its people, to every American, $1,000 check to every American? And I think from an American perspective, the answer is obviously no. If we don't want a dependent society, if we don't want a society that's totally dependent on the government, we as a society need to come together and say, keep your money. keep your checks. Insofar as we're able to do that. Now, I understand, like I said, there are people that work at restaurants and bars and things like that are totally out of work at this point. They're not going to see a dime, maybe, perhaps, most likely, for the next 2 months. I mean, that's just seems like what's going to be the case, at least for the next month, right? At most for the next 2 or 3. And so I could understand individuals like them who are put in that situation, who would be obliged to take the money and, again, feed the mouths that sit around their dinner table every evening, right? That would be the only responsible thing to do. Unless they have another option, like move out into the country and grow their own vegetables, which, as difficult as it may sound, that may not be a bad idea at this point when you see how things are going. Anyway, I've been making videos for the past couple days. I mean, just the last 2 videos, just really encouraging questions to be asked, because that's not happening a lot. I mean, we have people who are trying to be talking heads come out, and I've even given my opinion as to a few of the things here. But I think what's important to do is to be analytical about this, to really analyze the situation, and to be very critical in our approach with the government, with the COVID-19 outbreak, how we go about navigating that thing, especially as a church. You know, we're Christians. We're to be an intellectual people, and so I just think it's good to be asking questions, to be wrestling with a lot of these things at this point. So, God bless you guys. If this video was helpful for you, please feel free to share it. Give me a thumbs up if you liked it. If you did not, give me a thumbs down. Let me know in the comment section why it was that you gave me a thumbs down. Subscribe if you haven't already, and click the bell for continued notifications. God bless you.